So welcome officially to our afternoon panel on the work of Cynthia Leitich Smith. I am Carrie White. I am your Zoom host for the whole festival this week. So we want to welcome you back to the 2021 Neustadt Lit Fest. Our moderator for this panel on Cynthia's work will be Meredith Bigheart-Seagraves from the University of Central Oklahoma. But before I turn things over for introductions and officially getting us started, for those of you who weren't with us earlier today, I want to invite you to really engage with us during the session. You can use the chat box to engage with panelists, authors, and other participants. We've got the chat box wide open for you so that you can engage throughout the session. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with Zoom by now, but in case you aren't, you can take control of your own viewing options at the top of your screen. You can use view options to adjust your view. When we're not screen sharing, you in the top right-hand corner of your window, you'll see a place where you can switch between gallery view and speaker view. So you can make all of those adjustments based on your own personal preference. We do ask that you get prepared to submit your own questions to our panelists for later on in the session. If you have a question that's specifically for a panelist, if you would start that by writing the word question in all caps, that lets us know that you're not throwing it out to everyone in the chat just for some conversation, but that it's specifically for our panel. And if you would like that for a specific panelist, add their name after the word question. So you might put question for Monica and then add your question so that our moderator knows to call that out for her later on in the session. You can also use the chat box if you need any technical help. You can chat with me, Carrie White, or Richard Feinberg, who is noted on your screen as one of our co-hosts for this session. We'd be happy to help you in any way that we can. One of the Zoom tools that you have is closed captioning. You can turn this on to see a live auto transcription of the discussion if that is helpful to you. You probably got a notice just a moment ago that we are recording the session. So the benefit of that is that you or others can come back and watch the session later if you're not able to participate in the whole thing. We would ask that you keep your camera on if you don't mind so that our panelists can see your smiling faces while they're talking. But if you don't want your image recorded, you can, of course, keep your camera turned off. And then finally, it is the expectation of the Neustadt family and the University of Oklahoma that all participants of the Lit Fest enjoy a welcoming and inclusive environment, free from all forms of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. So we thank you for engaging with us in a respectful way. And now I'm going to turn things over to R.C. Davis-Undiano, who is the master of all things Neustadt Lit Fest, to introduce our moderator for today's session. R.C.?
Yes. Thank you so much, Carrie. Dr. Meredith Bigheart-Seagraves is a professor at the University of Central Oklahoma. She teaches indigenous cohorts. She teaches freshman composition to indigenous cohorts. She is an Osage citizen and a descendant of the Bigheart family depicted in Killers of the Flower Moon. Please give a warm welcome, as much as you can on Zoom, to Dr. Bigheart-Seagraves.
Thank you so much for that fantastic introduction, RC. Before I do introduce my fellow panelists, I wanted to just kind of give you all a rundown of what we are hoping to accomplish during this session. Really, we just want to have a conversation about what Cynthia Leitich Smith's works mean to us as authors, individuals, and educators. We'll do this by starting where each of us will just give a brief talk about a couple texts that we've chosen to focus on for the discussion. Then we'll move into a roundtable discussion, and following that roundtable discussion will be the audience Q&A. Carrie provided some fantastic instructions on how to actually input your questions into the chat. So it's time for me to introduce my fellow panelists. We have Dr. Monica Brown. who is the author of many multicultural picture books, including the acclaimed Lola Levine chapter book series, which has received many awards and accolades, awards. She also serves as a professor of English at Northern Arizona University. Our other panelist is Dr. Kimberly Wieser, who is an associate chair and an associate professor of English at the University of Oklahoma. She is affiliated faculty member with Native American Studies and Environmental Studies and is the National Director for Native Writers Circle of the Americas. She's also published a lot of scholarly work that is pertinent to Indigenous studies, including being a co-author for Reasoning Together, the Native Critics Collective. So welcome. And without further ado, we will go ahead and get into our individual talks. So on the schedule, Dr. Brown, you are listed as speaking first. So if you want to go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. I'm very honored to be on a panel with you, Meredith and Kim, and in the presence of Cynthia, someone I've known now for nearly 2 decades. I am very excited. I nominated Cynthia Leitich Smith for the NSK Prize, so I could not be happier. And when I thought about which of Cynthia's many books I would love to talk about, it was difficult to choose just a couple to focus on in these moments we have together today to share and to celebrate her remarkable body of work. But I thought I would begin at the beginning with Jingle Dancer, illustrated by Inghua Hu and Cornelius Van Wright, published in 2000. I too am part of the multiple decade club of producing and creating with love books for children. Though I write chapter books for slightly older picture books, my own career began with picture books, and it is a genre I love so much. It's a place where art and text meet, and a place that is filled with beauty, lyricism, and delight. So I love this art form, and when I revisit this book, Jingle Dancer, again and again, it's hard to believe that this is a debut piece. It's simply exquisite. Interestingly, because I thought I would start with sort of bookends, because I'm going to talk about Jingle Dancer and Cynthia's most recent single author book, Sisters of the Never See. And so I want to start with this book because it actually explores themes that 2 decades later, Cynthia will explore more deeply in this most recent novel, Sisters of the Never See. Themes of family, expanded notions of family, of community, of healing, because as Cynthia notes in her beautiful author's note at the end, jingle dances often evoke healing and prayer, or at least touch on them. This book explores storytelling, and ultimately joy. And it has a parallel thematic trajectory really to Sisters of the Never See. I'm laughing because I'm a Spanish speaker and I'm not from Spain, but they say like they use the all the time. So apparently I'm code switching as I talk today, the Never See. So in Jingle Dancer, a young Ojibwa and Muscogee girl, Jenny, wants to dance at her first powwow, but she is in need of jingles for her regalia, her dress. And they're made, I learned from this book, as so many children get to. Others get to recognize their traditions of powwow dancing, reading it, are rolled from silver and cans into cones. So she turns to her family, her extended family. And this is what I love as a Latina, as a daughter of an immigrant. We don't say all familial relationships are only via blood connections. I have many nieces. I am tia to many. My mom's best friends are my tias. So Jenny goes in search of support. and asked for jingles from different community members, her cousin, her neighbor. Even 20 years ago, this community was so rich and diverse in many ways. It's remarkable. And it speaks to the fact that Cynthia Leitich Smith is a visionary. I'm going to make you blush, Cynthia. As you will be blushing a lot if you blush. I don't think I've blushed for a couple decades myself. This week, because we're celebrating you. So that's what I'm doing. So what I love to, I want to talk about form because I love picture books. That's my passion. There's such poetry. I think of picture books as language distilled in the way poems are. I think of them as songs with choruses. I love the fact that as Jenny asks her community members for jingles to support her first dance at a powwow, she only wants a few because she doesn't want her grandmother, her great aunt, her cousin's dress to lose its voice. I love that image. The jingles are of the dress lended its voice. The dance has a voice. This is about storytelling too in a different way. And when Jenny dances at the end, she's gifting to her community back. And there's repeated phrases that are so beautiful, like the tink, tink, tink of the jingles and the brum, brum, brum of Jenny's heartbeat to the pounding of the powwow drum. Again, I want to end by noting other beautiful language from this little picture book with a big impact, because it so perfectly leads into Sisters of the Never Sea. Cynthia, in this beautiful picture book, Jingle Dancer, also speaks of the moon kissing the sun, good night, and sun fetching morning, offering us that beautiful poetry of this genre, the picture book. And this sun and moon leads me to the stars, and Cynthia's most recent book, in which the stars and a beautiful omniscient narrator play a wonderful role. I'm just going to read the first few lines of the book when we are introduced to this beautiful perspective. On page 3, high in the night sky, a cluster of curious twinkling stars gathered to observe the festivities. And then in the interest of time, I'm going to skip to the stars who are observing the very human drama taking place in this book. Then they turn their attention to the younger children of the family, the ones who hadn't grown up yet. The stars knew what was coming, who was lurking. They always did. They'd seen it all before, countless times across the vast green oceans and ethereal night skies. And this is just part of the beginning. We're introduced to an incredible family, a family of mixed race, a family of Indigenous children and British children, a family that redefines what has been discussed as stepsisters, etc. And this book is a revelation. It revisits and wholly retells J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, Peter and Wendy, and AKA Peter Pan, focusing on Indigenous perspectives and girls' perspectives and new approaches to this story of magic and fantasy of Neverland. I could talk about it for more than an hour, but I think as you've hinted at, the omniscient narrator immediately draws you in. This plot is so suspenseful, the character development so rich as we enter the magical world of Neverland that has real problems and prejudice, and there's children who are kidnapped, merfolk, fairies, so much excitement and community. And also there's thrills and worries as we read. It's absolutely captivating. And one thing I wanted to say about this remarkable moment is a moment of healing around the central character. And in a way, all these characters talk back to Peter Pan and the most pernicious stereotypes that we've seen represented in the Peter Pan books. And they talk back to Peter, who harms, who kills, who has real problems with how he treats members of Native nations and all Indigenous people, how he thinks about gender, animals, but he is a child. So the stars and his own shadow intervene. And as Cynthia said in an interview for this book, which so moved me because it is my mantra as well, Cynthia said, "We don't give up on children, not even the monstrous Peter Pan." I have to share something that sort of reveals Cynthia's spirit and perspective in her unguarded moments, which seems to be, she seems to be as profound and insightful as when she's speaking formally. So Cynthia, without your permission, but knowing you pretty well, after I finished this book, Sisters of the Never Sea, and you can imagine my delight, I nominated her for this prize before I read what will turn out to be my favorite book of all of her work. Not that I should pick favorites, but we do if we love books sometimes. I texted Cynthia and I didn't plan. This wasn't a setup, Cynthia. I didn't plan to use
Monica?
it. Yes.
I am so sorry to interrupt, but something just changed with your sound and we're getting some feedback.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you, because I want to make sure I'm almost done, but I will, is it better now?
It is better. Yes.
I'm fidgety, so I talk and move, and I'm probably creating the feedback myself, Carrie.
Okay.
So thank you for that. This has happened before, and even though I've been doing this so long. So I texted Cynthia because I live in the forest and I went for a hike and I decided I had to text her because I went on a path we call the fairy path. It's so beautiful in the forest. And I said, Cynthia, I want you to know I'm walking in the forest reflecting on your magical book. It's one of my favorites in recent memory and so full of love and import. And Cynthia replied, I'm profoundly honored, my friend. I believe my subconscious has been working on it since I was about a little girl, aching for magic that invited me in. And I wrote back, yes, it's so complex and wonderful and compassionate too. It speaks to both the girl and the literature professor in me. And Cynthia said, writing back all via text as I walked in the forest, it took so long to be welcome to write this kind of book of the heart. It's a delight to make such deeply felt and unapologetically Indigenous contribution to the conversation. Really, I didn't know if we'd ever reach this point. And our conversation went on, but out of respect for my amazing presenters and your opportunity to listen to them next, I'm going to end right here.
Thank you so much, Monica. I'm next on the list. So I wanted to talk a little bit first about what my contribution to today's discussion is focused on. It's focused on two main aspects of my life. One, the fact that these works resonate with me as an Osage woman, but also how, as an educator who teaches primarily Native students at the university, how these texts really are able to empower my students and how I've used them in the classroom to create these effects. So as mentioned earlier, just a little bit of context here. I do teach first-year composition at UCO. I do not have my PhD, maybe someday, but I am also, my position's unique in that I am the only instructor for the Native American, or first-year composition instructor for the Native American Success Initiative, which is the Native cohort group at UCO. So these are incoming freshmen who are part of this cohort experience. And that means that my classroom, primarily I am teaching Native students. Some semesters, every single student that occupies a seat in my class is Native and a part of this cohort. And so I use works of literature like Cynthia's in order to be very intentional about what I am presenting to my Native students. I take a very student-centered approach to the way that I present these works to them. And I'll discuss more of that a little bit later on, but the two texts that I want to focus on are a short story, a fantastic short story called A Real Live Blonde Cherokee and His Equally Annoyed Soulmate, which appeared in Moccasin Thunder, American Indian Stories for Today, which is an anthology from 2005. And then the second work is Hearts Unbroken, which again is a fantastic novel that was published in 2018 and also won the American Indian Youth Literature Award that year. So just to give you a little bit of information about what's going on in these texts before I start really diving into them. As I mentioned before, A Real Live Blonde Cherokee is a short story, and it centers around a protagonist whose name is Jason. As the title suggests, and he's a young man, probably late teens, he is both blonde-haired and Cherokee. And the text is really focusing on the fact that him being Native, but maybe not presenting as Native, really creates in him this heightened focus on the notion of Indianness and cultural authenticity. He hates the stereotypes that cause people to question the legitimacy of his own heritage. And he works in a costumes shop on South Congress in Austin, Texas. So if you've ever been to Austin and seen those Keep Austin Weird shirts, this is kind of the street that started that, a very interesting area of Austin. And at one point in the story, a young woman comes in and tells him that she wants to interview him about his Cherokee heritage. And his immediate reply is, quote, "My heritage is not work related." Okay, so despite identifying as Native, as Cherokee, right, he feels like he can kind of compartmentalize this facet of his identity. However, whenever a group of frat boys, as he calls them, are purchasing Halloween costumes, one of them brings a stereotypical Native headdress type Halloween costume to the counter. And based on Jason's reaction, we realize that his heritage is work related, right? Wherever you go, there you are. He can't really just conveniently call upon this aspect of his identity whenever it's easy, right? It shapes the way that he sees others in the world around him. The second text, Hearts Unbroken, like I mentioned, is such a fantastic novel. There is so much information in it. If you have not read it, you definitely have got to read it. But it takes as its focus the protagonist whose name is Louise, and she is a member of the Muscogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. She is a high school junior who lives in what the novel shows is kind of a small-ish suburb that's near Lawrence, Kansas. It is a fictitious suburb. It doesn't actually exist, but we realize very early on, the first chapter of the book, that her heritage as a Muscogee Creek young woman, is integral to her identity, okay? It shapes her interactions with others and also the world around her. She actually, in the first chapter, breaks up with a boyfriend that she really likes because he says something racist about Native people. We also see her introduced through Louise, Indigenous knowledges, right, that are specific to a lot of tribal realities. Despite having been raised in Texas and just recently moved to Kansas, Louise's concept of home is that Oklahoma is home, right? Despite having never lived there. And she identifies this place as being home because it is the hearth of her culture, her tribal culture. She also is, although this part of being Native and being Muscogee Creek is so integral to her identity as a person, she is a member, or actually on staff, for her high school's newspaper. And she tries to approach things with this objectivity, right, that we expect of journalists. However, her school's theater teacher ends up casting a number of BIPOC students in the school's production of The Wizard of Oz. And this group calls themselves the Parents Against Revisionist Theater, and they are protesting the fact that BIPOC students have been cast in these roles that weren't originally created, right, for them. This is the argument they make. So it's at this moment, this conflict, kind of like the costume with Jason and Blonde Cherokee, this moment that she really has to find her voice and be comfortable and confident and not just affirming her tribal identity, but also safeguarding it. So these texts, whenever I first read them, just on a personal level, I was so excited because I really understood a lot of these situations, the feelings, the cultural conflicts that these characters were experiencing. I mean, it touches on a lot of realities that Native people have to face often. This idea of expectations being imposed on you, stereotypes, your Native identity being politicized, all of these things. And I knew that because I could identify with them as a suburban Native of mixed heritage, that I could identify with these works. And I also knew that my students, right, would be able to identify with these works as well and see themselves in these texts. So, okay, so that is what I have to talk about with my two texts specifically. So Kimberly, if you would like to go ahead and start discussing the text that you've chosen to focus on for our discussion, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate being here. I'm honored to be here today. I'll add a couple of things to sort of contextualize where I'm coming from as I talk about the book. I teach here at the University of Oklahoma. I am blessed. I got my dream job I'd had since graduate school. So I teach Native American literature and rhetorics, but among the classes that I teach, my introduction to literary and critical studies has a Native theme, and it's Indigenous ghosts, monsters, and vampires. So I, in that class, teach not just English majors, but also a lot of language arts education majors. It's a required class for them as well, and NAS majors as well, Native Studies majors. It's not required for them, but sometimes I get people in there because of the theme. And I try to, in that class, always teach about teaching as I'm teaching them how to analyze literature and begin that process. My bachelor's degree was in ed, so I think I have sort of an extra concern about my students who are going to become teachers. So I try to include a mix of adult and young adult lit in that class so that there are some books they can carry with them and that they can use in their own classrooms. I also teach a Native American children's and young adult class. So I'm interested in Cynthia's work for these reasons. Something that I can't remember if it was in my bio or not. I am the National Director for Native Writers Circle of the Americas, which is the sister organization, the honor society, if you will, sort of an American Indian Academy of Arts and Letters was the original intent by founder Gary Hobson. It's a sister organization for Wordcraft Circle of Native Writers and Storytellers, which is more the mentoring portion of the group. And together we host Returning the Gift conferences. So my interest in Cynthia's work started a long time ago when I was reading Rain Is Not My Indian Name. I think that's the one among Cynthia's many, many awards, when I was reading that book for the Wordcraft Awards, which she won that year, Writer of the Year. So I've had an interest in her work for a long time. So today I'm going to talk about a book that you might not have come across yet. It's new-ish. Cynthia writes so much, which I am completely jealous. I don't know how you do it. I swear you must never sleep because you accomplish so much stuff. It just floors me. But I'm going to talk about something that might be sort of an outlier in terms of the body of the work as a whole, or at least the series that it's coming from. And it's Tantalized, right? So a little bit of a kind of sexy title. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But this book is part of a series of books and is related to another group of books that have were people in there. And even though the character has another character point out to her, our main character, that were people doesn't really make sense, right? It's the term we're using, and that's fine. We don't mean just werewolves. We mean were lots of things. We're possums, which is kind of cool, in my opinion, too. We're armadillos. And this is the normal part of this universe that this series of books comes from. It's common knowledge that these people, and vampires, because this is a vampire book, it's common knowledge that they exist. I was gonna be hooked on this book, as I am by many things that Cynthia writes, because I am a 6th generation Texan. I am the first person in my family to live in Oklahoma. or north of the Red River, since 1863. So it's been a hot minute since we were in this northerly kind of a place. So I'm going to be interested in it because of that. I'm going to be interested in it because of Austin. When I was a small child, my mother had, this is not a joke, an apartment on the corner of Riverside and Congress. There's no way anyone could ever afford to live there now. But she was in the U.S. Air Force, and at the time there was some housing there. So I'm very attached to that area. Lucy's Fried Chicken's like my favorite place on earth to go eat in the world. So I was gonna like the book. The book features the main character is Quincy Morris. Now she is named for the Texan who actually kills Dracula in Bram Stoker's Dracula, which I think is a fascinating metatextual kind of a thing to do here. And the Bowie knife that he has in that book shows back up in this as well. Quincy is a good girl. She grew up going to Sunday school. She is much like many average, although no one feels normal in middle school or high school, right? An average Texas girl. She played soccer. Her parents, though, have died tragically. So she has found herself orphaned at a fairly young age. She has an uncle who's not that much older than her, Uncle D, and together they are trying to run the restaurant that she has inherited. Her grandparents owned this restaurant on Congress Avenue, which is almost the only way to own any property or businesses on Congress these days. You almost had to inherit it. So it was probable, and I liked that because I'm kind of Aristotelian every now and then about things. And then her parents left it to her, but she needs help. So she's 17 as our novel begins. Her best friend is a wereperson. He is a werewolf. She also has a huge crush on him as well. And we kind of get this, we have an Italian food frame for the novel. So there was an Italian restaurant that they owned, but business is struggling. So she and her uncle have sort of rebranded everything, and it's now Sanguini's, the world's only, or at least Austin's only, I think maybe the world's only, vampire-themed Italian restaurant. And there's a nice little Bela Lugosi reference at the beginning of the book as well that ties that together. So this said, I'm going to start with the fact that, I'm going to go at it this way. Is this young adult? I think it borders on young adult and new adult. We've got a 17-year-old character. So whether or not, if you're including this book in something you might teach, right? Whether or not you consider it to be a book that you could teach as young adult in a secondary setting would largely depend on where you're teaching. I could very much, being a former classroom teacher, I could teach this book in Austin. I could teach this book in Norman High. I don't know about Norman North. I might not be able to teach this book in more conservative school districts, but it's something that I think my students would love to read. So kind of a fine line there. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because Quincy is healthy psychologically in this respect, that she is really open about her burgeoning sexuality. We don't see sexual acts in the book, but we do see some sexuality. And I think the word tantalize is probably a good descriptor for this. So when I was thinking about this, the fact that she's interested in sex and she thinks about becoming involved and doesn't know why her werewolf best friend that she has a crush on doesn't want her in the same way that she wants him. She doesn't realize he fears his power and that he might hurt her. And we also see some partial nudity in a sitting in the restaurant in Austin and some risque attire. And when I say partial nudity, there's some people that come in body painted. If you were in a restaurant in Austin, it could happen. I'm not saying it's unrealistic, but I am saying that it reminded me very much of a book I was so attached to as a teenager way back in the 1980s myself, Judy Blume's Forever. In fact, Judy Blume's Forever is far more explicit. So this book has a few nods to burgeoning sexuality, and that might be an issue depending upon where you're teaching. But is it age appropriate? Certainly it's age appropriate. As the mother of daughters who are now in college and a son, I will say that it's something I would have been absolutely comfortable with my kids reading, and I think it's age appropriate. I've got a 21-year-old and a 23-year-old. And so this is certainly, they're certainly not themes, right, that weren't part of our everyday conversations about their lives at that age. So that said, it's age appropriate. And I think it would interest my college students as well. And I kind of like that about this book because it's something that would maintain their interest while reading it, but also would transfer to something that I think should be available to teenagers and could be taught in some classrooms in some places. Second thing I want to talk about the book is it's not Native lit. It's lit by a Native person. And I think there's two different things here. It doesn't, in fact, have Native themes, but not all lit by Native people needs to be Native themed. Just like when we are really happy when Native actors and actresses get cast in roles that are not explicitly Native roles, right? That demonstrate that Native people are just people. Could this character, Quincy, if I didn't know better, be Native? She could be, but it's not explicit in the text. I think that that's actually a good thing. This is to say, though, that even though it's not a Native lit book in the sense that it has explicitly Native content, I do think it's a great book for teaching about diversity. I think it's wonderful for that, where people are accepted by some people and not by others in this society. There are times that where people can't access needed services because they're discriminated against in this way. I think also the book does a really great job of representing the kinds of values that I'm really proud to say our young people have today. I often brag on my students. I think Gen Z is doing some really great things in terms of being far more open-minded and supportive of diversity than previous generations. So I think the book does a good job of reflecting those values in terms of Quincy's own values. The book is respectful of gender fluidity. The book is respectful and normalizes being respectful of LGBTQ community members. And even though you might think, and I'm not going to do a spoiler on the book because I want you to be able to enjoy it the way I did, even though you might think all vampires are bad, right? You read much of this book thinking, oh, there are evil people here. The vampires, they're evil. They're all bad. By the time we get to the end of the book, you'll realize not even all vampires are bad. And even vampires, even people who've been made monstrous, if we're going to be metaphorical here, which I often do in my Indians, Ghost, Monsters, and Vampires class, right? Even if monstrosity is metaphorical, right? Even if we don't read it and play the believing game. Vampires, even those who've been made monstrous, can make choices to place the needs of others above the needs of the self. And I think the book really brings that home by the time we get to the end of the text. Other things that I do want to mention about this book that I think it also does a really good job of. Our character, and I don't think this is too much of a spoiler because you can discover it pretty early on. Our character develops a drinking problem. In fact, the adults around her are making alcohol really not just accessible to her, but because some of the adults have ulterior motives and can't be trusted. And certainly we can read this metaphorically, as dark as that is as well. They're in fact pushing alcohol on her at points. So we watch her struggle with this drinking problem. By the end of the book, she has had her senses weakened in a couple of ways, not just by the alcohol. And we get a real moment of clarity that sort of parallels the kinds of clarity that people can have as they're coming out of problems with addiction. And realizing the difference between thinking with a clear mind and not thinking with a clear mind. And then
I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but for the sake of time,
Okay.
if we could go into the roundtable discussion and hopefully we can touch on some of these other points that you have. But we wanted to try to have that Q&A for the audience the last like 15 minutes or so.
Sure, I'll just say one thing to wrap up with that. I think the other thing that it does really well is that it shows a character who's had to grow up really soon, right? And she just demonstrates a great deal of maturity and responsibility. So I think it does a fabulous job with that. And I'll turn it back over to you, Meredith.
Thank you so much. So before we do go into the audience Q&A, I wanted to ask the presenters if they have any questions that we would like to ask each other about any of the works that we've mentioned so far.
Meredith, I actually have a question for you because you spoke so eloquently about your students. I guess I would like to know if you want to elaborate on talking about the impact that you think Cynthia's work, like some of the texts we've discussed today or others, the impact it has particularly on our Native students, our Indigenous students?
Great. That's a fantastic question. I'd love to answer it. So the short answer response to that would be that I have found that Cynthia's works are really valuable for my classroom and for my Native students because it offers diverse representations of Native people, not what we always find in the standard works of literature that are written by Indigenous people. As I mentioned, I teach mainly cohort first year freshmen who are Native students, and there's a lot of literature about it, but they are definitely facing a lot of pressures that come with just going off to college, period, right? But the literature shows that Native students too are facing additional pressures that have to do with college or their culture, feeling isolated, feeling culturally isolated and alienated, feeling somewhat disoriented by being away from their tribal communities, home if they come from a town like that. And there are a lot of reasons that kind of make students feel disoriented in this way. But the one that I use Cynthia's works for is I really try to correct the trend or the reality that Native people and realities are really underrepresented. I mean, in just general society, but higher ed as well, right? Just even the population size. I think the national average hovers around 1% of undergraduate students identify as Native at UCO. We're fortunate in that we have 12.5% of our student body identifies as Native. So I am able to use works like Cynthia's to make sure that my reading lists, right, represent the Native perspective in my classroom. I want them to use these works as a way to like self-reflect, think about their own identities, their own cultural identities, but also to think about their own tribal communities. I think that by doing this, they're really empowered by recognizing that their Native identities are constructive to their academic purpose, right? And their professional purposes as well. So like I said, I would say diversity, right? That these works are showing such diverse representations of Native people. Like I mentioned before, in Real Live Blonde Cherokee, we're dealing with a Native person who is so apprehensive to claim his Native identity because people question it, right? So at UCO, I have students who come from a multitude of backgrounds. Some are very culturally inclined, some of them are not, some are in between. I have students who are what we consider identifiable, which means that people can look at them and either tell they're Native, or if they say they're Native, people don't question it. But I have a lot of students who are not in that position. And so whenever we read through this text in class and discuss it, they immediately connect with Jason, his anxieties, his apprehensions about his Native identity. He tries to prove it immediately. The story begins, he says something like, "I'm a swear to God, card-carrying, respectively thick blood Oklahoma Cherokee." So even the first line of the story, he is trying to prove it. He offers to give his tribal ID, to show a picture of his family members, right? To prove that they might look Native even though he doesn't. And for a lot of my students, at least, they, until we read this story, are kind of nervous to really investigate and discuss the fact that they can identify with this. You know, in Native communities, we have a hyper awareness, I think, too, of cultural fraud, people claiming to be Native and not being Native. So these are the pressures that my students and also Jason in the text, what they're really working against. Students have spoken with me privately in class discussion about how this work of literature, this short story, was the first time they ever read a story where they could identify with the Native character. And that is something that is very, very powerful. Real quickly, the other text, what time is it? 2:14. Okay. Hearts Unbroken. There's so much that you could talk about that benefits Native students. But what I want to focus on is something that I think is so unique to Cynthia's novel, is how timely and focused it is to Gen Zers, right? So those are the students who are coming into our classroom now, this idea of activism, right? Of their cultural identities informing who they are, how they see the world, being acutely aware of challenges that face BIPOC people, and not just having issues with the status quo, but being emboldened collectively, right? To tear down that system. And that's really what we see in Louise and her classmates that are non-BIPOC, right? They are wanting to change the system to really defeat these racist parents, right? Who are taking issue with the casting of this story. But okay, so I could talk about this forever, but I'm not going to.
Meredith, can I respond to your
Yeah,
comments?
sure.
We talked about this, that I'm so inspired by what you said, because I agree, the diversity of representations, the complicating of Indigenous people and who have been at times made caricatures of in literature. I think we are honored to have Dr. Debbie Reese in the audience, and I alluded to the diversity of her representation in Jingle Dancer, but in both, in many of her books, she has, for example, Black Indians. She represents that complexity that I, as a mixed race person, appreciate in creating whole characters that are not sort of described as fractions. What I always say when I wrote one of my most important picture books that Cynthia supported, Marisol McDonald Doesn't Match, No Combina, that our children contain multitudes. There's not a deficit fraction, half this, half that model, either in families with half siblings or steps, or in terms of the richness of our identities. And that really spoke to me when you described the impact that that story had on your students. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add to that discussion? Or I do have a question for Kim. Knowing all of your work that you've done and how you advocate for writing, Indigenous writing and everything, I was wanting to know, what do you think is Cynthia's contribution just to Native letters?
You know, for a very long time, I don't know that I'd want to put a frame on that. I think we always need more representation at the children and the young adult level. I've been doing this Native Lit thing for quite a while now, I guess nearly 20 years. In terms of, when I say doing this Native Lit thing, I mean teaching. That's what I mean. I mean teaching it at some level. And I used to have a really hard time teaching books that my students could take into classrooms in secondary schools in Oklahoma and Texas and teach. So I really felt like young adult, there was a huge need. And I noticed that Debbie was out there too. So Debbie, we may want you to follow up on this. I'm trying to think. I don't know if anyone besides maybe Joe Bruchac has been as prolific as Cynthia. And maybe there's somebody I'm not thinking about. Tim Tinkle has a lot of books too, but I think Cynthia has more, because like I said, I can't figure out, Cynthia, I cannot figure out how you write all this. I cannot figure out how you write all this. So in terms of increasing representation exponentially, I think that she herself has personally put a lot of labor into making that happen. So I think that she's hugely significant in that regard. Also, highly awarded writer. And I think representation is important in both ways, right? Both ways. Native young people need to see Native adults doing things that they might be, so they might be able to imagine themselves doing it. My husband is Comanche, not Pawnee. He's got Pawnee ancestry. Some people out there on the internet think he's entirely Pawnee, and he's enrolled Comanche and identifies as Comanche. He teaches here at OU. And as he said, one of the most important things that he set out to do when he started graduate school, right, is making sure that other younger Native people see people doing these things. So both in terms of Cynthia out there writing books, and sometimes they're Native lit, sometimes they're lit by a Muscogee Creek woman, right? Sometimes the content might be mainstream. Sometimes the content is mainstream but also Native, which is a nice trick that the late Don Birchfield really did a lot in terms of representation. More people consume images of Indians every year in literature than in any other way. Specifically, though, unfortunately, it's in women's romance novels written by non-Native people. That's where the most images of Indians are produced each year. So I think Native produced images and Native people being out there and succeeding in those two ways, Cynthia has made a huge contribution to Native letters. We know that Native young people are damaged by bad representations. When we look at the mascot issue, for instance, the American Psychological Association lets us know, right, that bad representation damages self-esteem. Good representation just the opposite of that. And I think that's a huge contribution.
Thank you so much, Kim. Does anyone have any other questions for our panelists? Kim, do you maybe have a question or?
I do. I have a question for Monica. Monica, since you're another children's book author, I wanted to ask you about Cynthia's contribution to the field of children's publishing and in terms of her making this a more diverse space as an Indigenous writer, as a BIPOC writer.
Sure, and I'm going to keep it brief because we want to hear from our audience members, but following directly with what you just talked about, Kim, I can think of no other Native writer who has so lifted up new and emerging voices across ethnic groups, but in particular Indigenous voices as well. You know, one of my other favorite writers, Toni Morrison, talks about how when you succeed, when you get your fancy degrees, your job is to help someone else get there too. Well, Cynthia has done this first and had an impact on so many people, myself included, when I was a young new writer of color, Latina, but also more recently in powerful, institutional, lasting ways as the curator of the Heart Drum imprint at HarperCollins, and having such deep influence in that way. And with anthologies like Ancestor Approved, bringing Indigenous writers together to introduce in really high profile ways voices that haven't had the chance to reach such large audiences as Cynthia has.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. No, I agree. I think the collective effort too is a really powerful thing as well. Any other comments or questions before we move on to the audience Q&A portion? Okay, well, if the panelists don't have anything else we want to discuss, then we'll go ahead and open it up to audience Q&A. So Daniel, if you wouldn't mind.
Not at all. Thank you, Monica and Kim and Meredith. That was really an inspiring and enlightening conversation and presentation. So I want to start with a question from Mandy Suor-Sitzma, who queried Monica. You've been reading Never See as a rewriting of Peter Pan. Maybe less obvious, but can we also read Hearts Unbroken as a rewriting of The Wizard of Oz?
That's oh, I'm so sorry, Meredith.
I'm sorry, I just jumped in there, even though
you
go ahead. No, you go ahead, please.
No, you. Well, that's a wonderful question. And I started thinking about it when I saw it, because we certainly have elements of the storm, but I wonder if sometimes when I'm puzzled, I turn to the author. And so I think that we should ask Cynthia. I could speak, but I actually think Cynthia's here. Cynthia, do you want to unmute and sort of answer those questions, try to answer that question? I don't want to presume my reading of your work.
I wouldn't want to presume my reading of my work. You know, when I'm thinking about story, I think about it in terms of the circle, and that the writer brings half of the circle and the reader brings half of the circle. And so whatever interpretation one leaves with is in fact true to them. One of the things that I felt was interesting as a writer who's published over time, we were talking a bit about the Tantalize novel, and it's the first of a quartet followed by a spin-off trilogy, is that there were young readers who began reading Tantalize at, say, 14 years old, who then in their 20s went back to it to reread so that they could catch all the nuances that were brushstroked in to the new releases. And they saw completely different things than they, with more life experience than they did early on, but they weren't wrong early on either, right? All perspectives are valid. That said, with regard to The Wizard of Oz, for a bit of context, in Hearts Unbroken, we have a situation where a new theater teacher has come to the suburban school and decided to shake things up. I don't know. Maybe she's been out on Broadway, she got inspired. And so she decides to cast inclusively, to open up roles that have previously defaulted to white young actors to any student who auditions. And that has caused some hurt feelings, some surprise, some feelings of entitlement that have been wounded in the process. So my protagonist, Louise's younger brother, Huey, has auditioned. He has been awarded a key role in the production. And then in the process of researching the background of it for a little bit of an article that will appear in the program, he realizes that L. Frank Baum, the author of the Wizard of Oz books, had a profoundly problematic history as the editor of newspapers in the time of Wounded Knee, and not only supported these genocidal measures, went back later and sort of doubled down on them, said that yes, they were good, and was really genuinely calling for genocide. That posed a problematic question to our young heroes. Do they proceed out of loyalty and solidarity to the castmates, particularly the castmates who are marginalized, who just finally had a chance to enjoy the spotlight? Or is their relationship between the artist and the art so hurtful that they're unable to bring their best performances to the stage and associate themselves with artistic work that came from that same original voice? So really the heart of it is the question on speech, the artist versus the art, something that we struggle with a lot, I think. Certainly there have been actors and filmmakers whose personal lives have been revealed as problematic, and maybe that changes our interpretation of their works. It's a very personal process. Some people can separate it, others can't. To me, I feel a lot of the conflict Huey did around the Wizard of Oz musical that I don't feel around The Wiz, which is a bigger reinvention and is a talking back. It's a reclamation of images of what home means from a perspective that I feel is sufficient to negate those original source feelings. So all of that I thought was interesting. It was worth having a dialogue. It was a chance to explore different reactions from different characters who were all principled good people trying to navigate their way through it. A lot of Huey's castmates are fine going on with the show. He does show up to support them, but his own role is a bit more complex than theirs because of his proximity to the pain. So that was my original thought. Is it a retelling of the Wizard of Oz story arc? There are elements, there's certainly nods. There is a tornado, but I wouldn't say it is as on point a retelling or reimagining in the way that Sisters of the Neversea is a reimagining and actively engages with what's on the page, as opposed to in Hearts Unbroken, what's happening behind the byline.
I love that intertextuality too, because if we are writers, we're all readers, we're all authors of our life, and our imagination gets to engage with each text. And that's one thing I love. Just as you mentioned, Ella Enchanted in Sisters of the Neversea. I love that intertextuality and the tornado. I think it's also ironic and fun, and it allows moments of multiple literacy where certain readers can say, aha, and causes them to rethink and analyze and gives them a new critical perspective. Meredith, you had comments to share before.
It just
I put Cynthia on the hot seat.
No, you're fine. It triggered my memory, and I think I got too excited about it. But we were recently in my class talking about the power of indigenizing these spaces, these texts through variation. And it just kind of made me think of, Sisters of the Neversea, how empowering that can be to reread these texts that, the Native presence, the BIPOC presence once denied, was denied access to. So yeah, I think it's such a fantastic tool, right, of decolonizing and making things a little bit more representative. So,
and I love that Louise is a journalist, and I love that Wendy is a storyteller who dramatically changes the narrative of Peter's story, because we're also modeling young people finding their own voice and taking risks and modeling a type of activism, right, especially in Hearts Unbroken.
And you see that in Rain Is Not My Indian Name as well. And I'm just wondering, Cynthia, since you republished this book 20 years after the original publication, this idea of brushstroking, it intrigues me. Could you say a little bit more about how you thought about maybe repackaging this book for an audience for 2021?
Certainly, and I'll talk a bit more about this in the keynote. It was both a huge honor and profoundly humbling to revisit my first novel in depth after 20 years. It was interesting how much had changed. We made several shifts due to technology, quite different today than it was at the time. Rain Is Not My Indian Name is one of the first books that integrated a website at all, for example. And I was surprised by how well that aspect of the technology actually held up. The absence of cell phones was a bigger problem because Rain is more of a tween than a teen YA. It does help that not all parents are as eager to put them in hands, but I certainly had to adjust for that. I would say probably the most interesting aspect of it was reconsidering my own discretion on the page. Because Rain was my first novel, I felt more influenced by the expectations of the market, by mainstream critics. There was at the time very much the idea that young readers could be trusted to the point that suddenly perhaps deprived them of some of the connective tissue that they needed to realize what's really going on in situations that are new to them. So there were certainly cases where I offered more context and cases where we had to tweak a bit. It was interesting. I will say that Star Wars and Star Trek held up very well and remain highly popular with the audience. And so nobody touched those references. Rain's dog is and shall forever be Chewbacca, nicknamed Chewie.
There's a question from Eric Riggs about intentionality. He writes, I am non-native, but I am able to relate to the characters in the works due to sharing some experiences. When I was younger, where I grew up, loss of loved ones and social class, etc. When writing such detailed stories, is this intentional to make the works more inclusive? So maybe that's a question for Cynthia as well.
I would say what we're trying to do is convey three-dimensional humanity on the page. We talked about how each of us is made up of a myriad of influences, that we contain multitudes. If we're going to have characters that ring true, who are relatable as people, we had to push back beyond sort of two-dimensional paper dolls that would be cultural spokespeople or historical props. We had to get to characters that readers would fall in love with, that they would see themselves in, that they would push back against where that was the appropriate reaction. So am I thinking I need to have my character show that full range of emotion to be relatable? No, I'm thinking she's a human being. And therefore, she has a heart, she has a mind. And that intrinsically is going to connect her to others, both by idiosyncratic interests, but also by the universal ones that we all experience. We all face grief. We feel moments of joy, which is something that's very important to me to bring to the page, especially when reflecting Indigenous characters. We all face moments of uncertainty. And as someone who writes for adolescents, I would say probably awkwardness is the overriding quality, because when everything is new and uncertain, we often fumble a little bit, and that fumbling brings growth that is relatable.
Thank you so much for that. The next question I see in the chat is from Morgan Locke. She writes, what steps does the panel organization take to help young Native adults in literature?
I'm wondering if Morgan might be wondering about Native Writers Circle of the Americas or WordCraft, or if she or he is wondering about World Lit Today. I'm not sure.
I was actually curious, Kim, about your references to Joe Bruchac and others, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about the kind of the pan-Indigenous community ethic and ethos of WordCraft.
I learned when writing my dissertation. I was at Baylor University. At the time, I was married to someone who had cows. You don't move cows to go to school. So I did 3 degrees at Baylor. And I got a lot of help from people like Gary Hobson, the recently passed Steve Russell, Vine Deloria, and was just really blessed just because Dan Littlefield is my grandma's cousin, even though they had not met once I started meeting people. But WordCraft, NWCA, and RTG all really grew out of an event that happened here at the University of Oklahoma in 1992. So everything started in 91. Joe Bruchac, not only did his late wife at that time have cancer, Joe took out a second mortgage on his house. I don't know how many people know this. There was a lot of money raised for that first festival, but Joe took out a second mortgage on his house and paid a lot of it. I'll tell you that right now. A lot of people don't know that about him. So I learned while dissertating, pan-Indigenous, pan-Indian. It's not really a good word because it's not a good thing because it erases difference, right? In the community, intertribal, when we do things together, when there are things that are for people of more than one tribe, is a thing. In Oklahoma, our state law is pretty clear that the words American Indian means someone who is enrolled in a federally recognized tribe. There is a lot of controversy and always has been, basically since the beginning of the Native Literary Renaissance in '68, about inclusivity, who belongs in our literary canon, who doesn't belong. And I think that identity has been something controversial probably in Indian country since 1493, I imagine. Find ways to find controversy. So who you count in and count out, different. But in terms of the work, which is what the second question was, which is what I'm interested in. WordCraft Circle and NWCA and RTG have, over the course of the last 20 some odd years, provided workshops and different learning opportunities across Indian country as much as humanly possible on a strictly from a body of volunteers, right, to get out and do workshops for young people and to encourage writing among Native youth. I will say we haven't had a whole lot going on since 2017, since we did the last Returning the Gift conference. My oldest daughter passed away a few months before that event. And so I need help getting things done. It's been hard for me to do by myself. So I'm hoping we are looking for a creative writer right here at OU right now. Cynthia, position's still open until it's filled. If you want to leave the wonderful Mecca of Austin, man, we're hoping that we've got an enrolled writer that ends up here at OU who might want to do some more work with NWCA. And I know other work has grown in the meantime from people who started in WordCraft and NWCA. So that is to say, we do workshops, we do work with Native youth. We need a lot more help doing that because right now we is me and Gary Hobson, and Gary's retired. So need help.
What I like about that question, if I'm taking a more individual approach to it, like if Morgan, who is saying, oh, okay, well, now I know. I thought she was asking, what are you doing as individuals? And I do think we each have an individual responsibility to each other, to our communities, and was going to answer in that, but it has to do, as Megan just said in the comments, with the American Indian Library Association. And I don't think I'm the person to answer that.
I know Debbie Reese has been active on the chat. Debbie, would you like to chime in to say anything, or unless there are any other questions that I missed, please feel free to jump in. Or did anyone else on the panel know about the AILA and could speak to it?
I can say that the American Indian Library Association is a division of the American Library Association that sponsors the American Indian Youth Literature Award, among other programs. If you go to my website, you can find links to the organization and its activities, as well as a plethora of additional teacher educator resources.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yeah, we're down to the last few minutes here before we wrap up. Would anyone else like to pose a question to the panel or offer a comment?
I got a question
Meredith,
for Cynthia. Oh wait, unless if there's another one, go ahead, Daniel. I'll wait.
no, I didn't see. I don't see anything else in the chat. So go ahead, Kim.
I want to know what you're working on now.
I have a couple of projects that are in progress. The first is the Blue Star series, which I'm co-authoring with Kekla Magoon, and it's a graphic novel middle grade series that will be illustrated by Molly Murakami. The Blue Stars is a series about two cousins from a Black and Native family who are drawing on their particularly strong personalities to become superheroes fighting for voting rights in their middle school and neighborhood community. It's extraordinarily fun. Essentially, Kekla and I are writing our inner 12-year-olds on the page, and Molly's art is simply darling. The second, more just individual to me project that I'm working on is also set in the world of Hearts Unbroken and Rain Is Not My Indian Name. The book is centered on Huey Wolf, the little brother of Louise, who is the protagonist of Hearts Unbroken, and both his sister and cousin will reappear.
Thank you. And I also wanted to thank you for your representations of young Native male protagonists as well, because I also think that that's an area where we need a whole lot more work done. So thank you.
Thank you.
Meredith, do you have anything else to send us off on behalf of the panel?
Sure. On behalf of the panel, I want to say thank you to everyone who's attended. Thank you to the Lit Fest for creating this avenue and opportunity for us to discuss Cynthia's works. Whenever I look back and think about Cynthia's works and what they've meant to me and the rest of us here on the panel, it made me think of Daniel Heath Justice, letter to an emerging Indigenous writer. And in that letter, he says, quote, "To be an Indigenous writer is to be part of a long legacy of struggle and survivance, of determination to speak truth into a world that too often insists on Indigenous silence." And so I just want to say to you, Cynthia, thank you so much for being a part of that legacy, for inspiring that legacy, and also for creating characters, right, that are also using their voices and resisting that silence that's often been expected of Indigenous people. So yes, thank you. And I think Carrie might be closing us out. I'm not sure.
I think so. Carrie, do you have?
I do. I have just a couple of last thoughts. So first of all, thank you to the panel. Thank you to Daniel for facilitating the Q&A. And thank you to Cynthia for impromptu being a part of the Q&A discussion. That was really helpful. I do also want to thank our sponsors of the Lit Fest, just for making it the best that it can possibly be. So we thank you for your participation. If you'd like to know more about the sponsors, you can find that information on the event website. And then I do hope that you will all join us at 4 o'clock Central Time. So for reference, that's in a little over an hour. Come right back here to the same location. We will be having readings from our 2022 Neustadt Prize jury and book giveaways from each of them. So please, if you would, join us back here in a little over an hour. And again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and participation in this discussion. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.